Hello, everybody. Welcome to Spring 2 2025, which is years going really quickly. Thank you for joining us. This is our community engagement. We used to call it a town hall, and we will be speaking today about CACREP and why it's important for you. But before we jump right in, I'd like to ask any faculty members who are here to go ahead and greet everybody. Say hi, Dr. Moore. I know you already spoke, and I did. I see Dr. Crowley's here, Dr. Brown, Dr. Rice.
Hi, Dr. Andy Brown, interim chair here. It's good to see everyone. I'm glad you could make it out tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
Hey, I'm Dr. Jeff Rice. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Brown.
Great. And I'm Dr. Crowley. Good to see everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Crowley. Any other faculty members here? No?
Dr. Troutman is representing from the great state of South Carolina.
Hello, Dr. Troutman. Anyone else? All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, there'll be 3 faculty members possibly. Dr. Foster may jump in because she sits on the CACREP board. Dr. Dickson may jump in because he is our CACREP liaison, but I will get started first, introduce myself, and then our esteemed speaker here, and we'll be talking a little bit about CACREP after I talk about the history. I'm Tiffany TRushWilson. I'm the program chair for CMHC and CES, and I will be talking with Dr. Carl Sheperis here, who I'm really excited to have talk to us. I'm the vice, not the vice. I am the program chair, but with respect to CACREP, I became aware of CACREP in my master's program where I had to speak to CACREP representatives during our site visit, same as a doctoral student. And then as an adjunct, I had to participate in the site visit where I was first teaching. And then at the university where Dr. Sheperis and Dr. Moore and I worked, and several other people, I was a part author of our self-study, and the same is true here. And I'm also a site visitor. So I have those little pieces, but not the extensive background that Dr. Foster, Dr. Dickson, and especially not Dr. Sheperis has. So Dr. Carl Sheperis, Vice Provost and Dean of Graduate Studies, Kurztown University. He used to be the chair, or the former chair, Board of Directors and interim president and CEO of NBCC. Has extensive leadership experience in higher education and higher education administration. So Dr. Sheperis, is there anything you'd like to tell us about yourself before we jump into the history of CACREP?
I like New Kids on the Block. They're one of my favorite groups. I enjoy music, fishing, outdoors. I think, part of the reason I share stuff like that when people ask me that question is I'm just another person, just like everybody else, right? I live a humble life and enjoy getting the chance to meet and talk with students. So being able to come to a meeting like this, a community engagement meeting, is something that really is fun for me. And I get really excited about the opportunity. So before you jump in, I wanted to share that CACREP is something really important to me personally because its foundation, how it was developed, came out of the University of Florida, where I was a doctoral student. And some of my professors were really foundational in creating CACREP as an accreditation body. And Carol Bobby, who's the former CEO of CACREP, she and I were peer doctoral students under the same doctoral chair at University of Florida. And so when I was a doctoral student, I was pretty much told that I would be supportive and involved in CACREP as a doctoral student, and have been ever since. So I've been a site visitor for CACREP for 25 years. I've been a team chair, so I chair the visits to other universities. And I've done a lot of work in accreditation advocacy, where I've done a lot of testimony in different states, state legislatures, and with the federal government over the years, just in terms of making sure that counselors have appropriate privilege to practice and that our accreditation is recognized throughout the country.
Excellent, thank you. So before we jump in and really get into the heart of CACREP and why it's important, I want to give a tiny bit of background to the students in case people don't know. CACREP's been around since 1981. Its mission has been to set standards for counseling programs broadly and make sure that we meet educational and professional standards, excellence, that they are reliable standards across programs. At first, CACREP was a developmental body, making sure that programs had what they needed to achieve accreditation, but it's kind of shifted its role a little bit. And lately it's more evolved into a regulatory body. It emphasizes the enforcement of established standards. It needs us to maintain integrity and quality of counseling education. So there is reliability and validity across our field. The shift reflects CACREP's commitment to wanting the public to be protected, but the professionals and the profession to be protected as well. And another thing I want you to make sure you realize is, well, do you know how many CACREP areas are there? Do you guys know how many core content areas we have in CACREP? Yes, thank you. There are 8 areas. So we have professional counseling, orientation and ethical practice, social and cultural diversity, human growth and development, career development, counseling and helping relationships, group counseling and group work, assessment and testing, research and program evaluation at the master's level. Also, we have standards in CACREP. The most recent standards are the 2024 standards. There are 6 areas in those standards. Please go to CACREP's website and become familiar with them. The standards require that programs show their capacity to function in 6 areas. Well, there are 6 areas in the standards. The first one is the learning environment. And we want to make sure under that standard that the programs are operating the way they are supposed to, that there's transparency, that the faculty and staff are qualified to do the work that they are doing. The second area is academic quality. We want to make sure that the core content areas are covered for the counseling students. We want to also make sure that student learning is monitored. Third area, foundational counseling curriculum, details the 8 areas we just went over. Fourth area is entry-level specialty status. We want to make sure that the standards for the various counseling specialties, like CMHC, school counseling, marriage, couple, and family counseling, are clear and the training requirements are followed. The doctoral standards are under Area 5. And then the 6th area is program evaluation and improvement. We want to make sure that the program self-evaluates, continuously improves. Those are the basic things that we need you to know about CACREP. Hopefully there were no surprises in any of the stuff that I just went over, but wanted to make sure for those of you who might not know that you have that background. So I don't know if Dr. Dickson or Dr. Foster are here, but Dr. Sheperis, I'd like to just ask you, why should students care? I do see Dr. Dickson's here. Hi, Dr. Dickson.
Hello.
And I'll ask this to you as well.
Go ahead,
Why
Mark.
should students care about CACREP?
Dr. Dickson, I defer to you if you'd like to jump in.
I'll start. I had the very same experience that you did in the fact that my doctoral program, I had a professor that said, this is what you're going to learn, this is what you're going to do, and this is what you're going to force down your throat. And lo and behold, years later, I'm still doing CACREP stuff because it is so very important to our field. I like it shows some uniformity in the education. We have to explain to students a lot of times, I mean, you should be able to leave one school and go to another CACREP school and walk into, I don't know, lifespan development. And it should essentially be the same kind of work, same kind of curriculum, for some uniformity and making sure that we're learning all the things that we need to learn. And I think it's also important to know that Dr. CRW said that they've gone much more regulatory than developmental, and I think that's fair since we've kind of moved past. I mean, as you said, 1981, right? And we're many standards down the road. So at some point we have to move past that developmental approach and grow into something that we are making sure there's continued compliance and uniformity. It's good for students to know, because when they're looking for jobs, when they're looking for state licensure, that is going to be the most important thing. I don't know if there's anyone in here that is from Florida. But I'm just going to tell you now, when you graduate, you will receive. Dr. Sheperis is probably laughing. You will graduate, and you're going to get a letter from them that says you are deficient, and you're going to send me that letter because of my job with as director of clinical training, and say, Dr. Dickson, I need this letter from you saying that I went to a program. And typically, I'll respond to you, or might ignore it for a day or two, simply because the follow-up letter will be, oh, we received your transcript and your CACREP accredited, so there is no problem. So that's one of the first things when you're reading your application, when you're turning those in, that when they see that, they know there's some uniformity there. And the same thing will go, I have one right now sitting in my inbox I need to help a student with because they're trying to figure out where these classes go in the categories. And it always the same, really. There's not, there's not much variability. Anything I missed there, Dr. Sheperis? All right.
No, I think that was a great overview. I would, from my perspective, just as you think about it as students, let's start broadly. When you think about a university, universities are accredited, right? And in order to get financial aid, a university has to be accredited, and so students have to be able to look for that when they're selecting a university. Accreditation is in every professional program. It's not just in counseling. So if we're thinking about an accredited medical school or an accredited nursing program or an accredited law school, right? And the same things that Dr. Dickson was talking about. And the reason for that is that if we know that a university or a program is accredited, we can expect the same type of education to occur regardless of which school it is. So what we see, as Dr. RushWilson was saying, is uniformity that's occurring in different counseling programs. So if you go to one program in the Midwest or another program in the South or an online program, your education is going to have the same courses. What'll be different is the flavor that's in those courses and how the professors deliver it and what the focal points are in terms of expertise. But the general content and scope of the courses is going to be almost exactly the same.
Thank you. So then I have a question for you. When it comes to accreditation of us being CACREP accredited or any program being CACREP accredited, how does that impact licensure or certification or employment opportunities? Does it really matter? If a program is CACREP accredited or CACREP aligned, not every program is accredited. What's the benefit?
So I'll jump in on that. This goes back to my early days when we were first starting to develop licensure in the United States. Counseling as a profession is young. And it was a major process in each state to figure out how do counselors actually become as LPCs or LMHCs. Each state, one by one, had to go through a legislative process where they passed a licensure law. Now we have licensure in all 50 states. Some of those licensure laws have become so specific that they actually include CACREP language in the licensure requirement. And so it becomes impossible for you to even have a pathway to licensure in some states if you don't have a CACREP degree. The other part is if you wanted to practice in an area like, for example, the Veterans Administration. Their requirements are that for a counselor to be employed, you have to graduate from a CACREP accredited program. So those are just two examples, if you wanted to jump in, Dr. Dickson, of ways that it's important from a licensure standpoint.
Muted myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you nailed it with my thinking on. There are literal states, because we deal with so many different states. There are literal states that just say in their licensing requirement, education, 2 or 3 sentences, CACREP accredited. That's it. There are states that look at your licensure different. I went to a non-CACREP master's program, CACREP PhD program, and my state changed my status once I had a CACREP degree.
What do you mean?
So like, for example, in Texas, I went when we first got licensed, me and actually my dissertation chair, we actually had a hard time with them a little bit getting licensed at the time because they had changed some of their rules when we were going for our re-up. And some places just simply do not consider a non-CACREP degree nowadays. And some of them are actually holding that not somewhat retroactively now. So I think part of, and I think Dr. Both of you could probably speak a little bit better than me on some of this. I've kind of lost track, but with the compact, we also have a lot of states that are going to very heavily focus on you must be CACREP accredited. You have those states that hold back, but at some points there are places that just simply will not really acknowledge a degree from a non-CACREP, or they make you jump through excessive curriculum and syllabi review of your program. And right now I'm trying to think of a state that still does that. Can't off the top of my head.
So essentially, what could happen to someone is they could go through a master's program that's not accredited and get to the point of wanting to be licensed and be ineligible for licensure.
It can happen.
Yeah, it definitely can happen. And you mentioned the compact, Dr. Dickson, so
Yes, sir.
that's a good entryway to really talk about how CACREP and licensure fold into that. So most professions have developed over the last several decades agreements from state to state, where if one state accepts a license, if you're licensed, for example, in Florida, then Louisiana will accept your license and just transfer it. That's called reciprocity, right? And there were little agreements happening between states a couple of decades ago for counseling, whereas other professions had made these national agreements, consortiums. They've made the ability, a compact, to agree if somebody's licensed in one state, then in all states you could be licensed. Counseling's still been working on that process for a number of years now, and we've made a ton of progress in the last few years in getting states signed on to the compact idea. So previously it was just one state might have an agreement with 2 states or 3 states, or and if you were licensed in Florida, you could be licensed in Louisiana. But what we're moving toward is this agreement of what the requirements are in order for somebody to be licensed regardless across the compact. And so states that have had lower requirements than CACREP have argued, well, we have fewer counselors, we need to be able to be flexible and to allow lesser requirements. And the other states that have more stringent requirements, with CACREP being the standard, have said absolutely not. The gold standard has to be the CACREP requirements and the CACREP accreditation for us to move forward with a compact. And that's really been the point that's moved forward with having the same requirements that CACREP has: number of hours, number of clinical hours, the ability to have your practicum and internship, and going through all that process. So as we continue to do the advocacy part and the compact grows further and further, the idea of having a CACREP accreditation is going to be the key or the gateway for you to be licensed in just about any state.
So I have a question, Dr. Dickson or Dr. Sheperis, either one of you. What, for students, and I'm sure most of them are familiar, but for those who aren't, what are you talking about when you mention compact? What is that? What do they need to know about the counseling compact?
So I could talk about the origins of it and then how it's evolved. I actually had the opportunity to work on a lot of that initiative up front as it began. It starts with state licensure boards. And so each licensure board is appointed by the governor and of that state. And the licensure board oversees the regulatory process to decide who is able to become licensed, who meets the criteria. You apply to the licensure board for your approval for that license to come in play. And that it's not just a counseling license, so it's whatever professional license the state regulates licenses. So even a barber needs a license to practice. And that's done through the state. States have an association, the American Association of State Counseling Boards. And so they actually have like a conference every year, and everybody comes together through AASCB, all the licensure boards, to discuss common issues across the states. NBCC, which Dr.
RushWilson mentioned, I had been interim CEO of and spent 6 years on their board of directors, was integrally involved with AASCB in starting to look at those common issues. The American Counseling Association, the American Mental Health Counselors Association, and a couple of other groups all attended the conference and started to have this discussion about how can we come together and look at commonalities across the states to make an agreement that allows all participants, all counselors who are interested in getting licensed to go through this process. So it's basically signing on to the idea that we will have a common pathway for all counselors to come together. And so that emerges from ASCB and through the professional associations. And it goes into discussions with the legislature and the approval by the legislature for the state counselor board to move forward with it. And I can't remember exactly how many states we have signed on right now. I don't know if you know that off the top of your head, Dr.
It was 39 the last I checked, but I'll check again real quick.
There are some states that are going to be difficult to get on that compact. There's a few that are just notorious for having some difficulty in terms of legislative advocacy and moving things forward, but we believe that the majority of the states will get there. So there's a map that you could be directed to that'll show you which states are already signed on and which states are in the process or have something on the books in terms of being proposed and being brought up in the legislature for discussion. So the majority of the states are in that process now. So you'll see that there's a couple of states that just don't have any, the gray have no legislative action at this moment. And each of those states had some significant challenges. New York and California being the last two states to ever get licensure. And there were lots of issues from a legislative process in terms of establishing the licensure, a lot of negotiation across different professions to establish it. And so the compact in those states is going to be tough. And California just does its own thing quite often. And so for even example, there's an online regulatory compliance process called NC-SARA. California is the only state that doesn't participate. So they just kind of do their own thing with regard to regulation and regulatory compliance. But as you can see, the majority of the states are signed on. And for the ones that aren't, there's legislative action happening. There's only a handful that are in limbo at the moment.
Yeah, you also make some really important points that sometimes kind of get missed by students and even faculty and folks. I think one of those is that a lot of these things can clearly be very sociopolitically, culturally driven. For example, you see Texas and New Mexico right there are kind of at the same place. Well, being a resident of Texas, I know as a licensed therapist in Texas that I can walk across the border into New Mexico and probably leave the state the same day with my licensed to practice in New Mexico because that relationship is similar. And New Mexico is exactly what you described, Dr. Sheperis, which is they don't have the counselors, they don't have the population, they have some programs, but you know, a lot of they just kind of rely on sometimes Texans and other states to come in and support and help, and so they maintain that close relationship. And you had mentioned earlier, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's Kentucky and Tennessee that have very easy reciprocal relationships. So a lot of times those places have very, again, sociocultural, political perspectives. You know, I mean, just be honest, you know, California out there really does do its own thing. It's very much driven by the MFT um, profession. And then I think an important thing for students to know who attend our school is when you look at that map and you look at anything we do, you have to understand that we go by the strictest limits of any state in which we have students. So sometimes I'll call out a state for fun, but my students in Georgia will get mad because we have rules that are counter to, or practices and policies that are counter to what maybe their state says, but we're having to follow the rules of, I don't know, Kansas or California or Texas, or, and you pointed out a minute ago, New York being another one of those states. New York notoriously during COVID and since were the bane of our existence. They were so difficult to deal with when it comes to supervision and standards and many of those things.
So with all that in mind and knowing how important CACREP is, what kind of misconceptions have you heard students embrace, internalize, believe about CACREP and CACREP accreditation?
That could go on a while, I would think. I think one of the ones that really happens a lot, and I would like to hear Dr. Sheperis too. Obviously, he's been more active in these things and been in the field longer than I. I think one of the ones we hear and we've run into is students having a really hard time with field work. They really don't understand why they can't just get their, you know, 500 or 600 or 700 hours in one internship and be out the door. And that's a CACREP thing, but that's also a state licensure thing, and it can depend on the state that you're in. That is the one I hear probably the most, but again, that would be because of my position. And then also the part where students want to get licensed, and then when you're new to your licensure, they want to run and get licensed in many places. And a lot of times we're telling them it is easier to focus on one location that has some reciprocity or where you currently are, rather than try to get licensed in 5 states at the same time.
Okay.
Some great points there. What I would also just like to mention is that my experiences have changed with students over the years, and I'm going to guess that many of you who are on the call, when you were shopping for a program, you were pretty savvy as a consumer and looked for a CACREP accredited program. Maybe not because you understood what CACREP was, but that you knew from some research that having a CACREP program was important. So you could do a quick Google search, and if you looked up counseling graduate programs, CACREP would come up in that search pretty quickly. But by not understanding it, that does develop some misunderstandings along the way of why do we have certain requirements. So one of the things to know is that there is a group called the Council for Accreditation, Council for Higher Education Accreditation, or CHIA. And CHIA is a group of an association that represents all the different accrediting bodies. So it could be medicine, it could be nursing, it could be law, and CACREP is a part of CHIA, and when or recognized by CHIA as an accrediting body. And so what that means then is that there are some standards that have to do with any type of accredited professional accreditation that we have to meet. And so that means about the uniformity of curriculum, the same requirements from program to program, the assessment process, making sure that there's a data that supports the program actions, making sure that there's a very clear admissions process. And sometimes students think it's just the whim of faculty, the way we do certain things, and don't recognize that we as faculty members have always had to follow accreditation requirements and ensure, because we have to report out our data back to CACREP every year and say, yes, we are still following the standards and this is how we do it.
So thank you for bringing up CHIA. So one of the things that happens in admissions is we'll ask students, especially before the questions change. We recently changed our admissions questions. And students would say often, I want to get this master's in counseling because I ultimately want to become a clinical psychologist. And I've talked to both you, Dr. Sheperis and Dr. Dickson, and many other people about what I call the mental health sisters, how there are multiple mental health specialties that work in collaboration, but none is better or something than the others. We all do our own thing. With that in mind, and with the accreditation as developed as it has become, Dr. Sheperis, Dr. Dickson, do you think that counselors are trained equally well or even better in some ways than the other mental health sisters? And do we hold our own in this mental health world? Should someone be aspiring to do something else to have that counseling skill that they need, or do we provide it within our own field?
A loaded question. I think, as you said, they're sisters, right? But they're not twin sisters.
No.
You know, we do a lot of the same things, and we do a lot of different things. And I think as long as those different professions kind of understand where we all kind of land, it's not a competition. It's an effort to help people in different ways. And I think the CACREP, that the counselor education programs, CMHC programs, and then educationally CES doctoral programs do a good job in training people to be counselors and counselor educators. You know, when you look at some of the other like CACREP standards, for example, it's not just clinical mental health. You know, they have all those other programs, rehabilitation counseling and CRC counseling. They have, you know, MFT, addictions, all of those things. And it can depend. I mean, you students are aware of the fact that your electives depends on what state you're in. You know, I'm in Texas. So addictions is something that we have to have as far as the class. There are other states that will not let counselors at certain levels, depending on your licensure level, to be substance abuse counselors, where they may have a different view of a clinical psychologist or a social worker or a clinical social worker or any number of them, MFTs. And then I always tell people, I think that you need to understand stay in your lane too. I understand we can work with marriage and family therapy and do a good job. But marriage and family therapy, we take 1 or 2 classes generally, and it's an entire profession. And I think we have to have respect for the positions that others are in. You know, social work has a different view than we have. The training hours, the training experiences are different. So I don't think it's qualitatively better or worse. I think it is qualitatively different. That's
So
my political statement. Go ahead, Dr. Sheperis.
yeah, I just jump in from my own experience. And this is something that you may not know, Dr. TRushWilson, but I actually have completed a second doctorate in psychology, have a doctorate in counselor education and supervision. And the reason I did it was because I was spending a lot of time working on counselor parity laws. And it gave me a chance to really talk about assessment practices. And so I never got licensed as a psychologist because my identity is as a counselor. So I could speak to this perspective of similarity and differences from programs just from my own, training and background. And what I will say is that counseling as a master's degree is the only truly clinical degree at the master's.
Very true.
If you go into a psychology master's, like you said, you were saying, Dr. Dickson, neither better or worse, but it's not a truly clinical degree. It covers a lot of different areas of training, experimental, industrial, systems, right? So it gets into all different areas of operation. Social work, again, gets into resource allocation. Um, so they do have clinical background, but a counseling master's degree is a truly clinical pathway. There are changes as you get to the doctoral level in different approaches. So if you're in a clinical psych doctoral program, that is more focused on clinical application. The doctoral program in counselor ed is not as clinical. So there's a very clear difference between the pathway between a master's and a doctoral program in counseling. It moves from clinical to a combination of clinical research and higher ed, whereas the master's in psychology moves from a generic to a more clear pathway toward clinical practice as a clinical psychologist. Social work kind of stays the same as it moves from master's to doctoral level. It's just more advanced in terms of all the different pieces of it. So it really depends on what your personal belief is and way of seeing the world, your identity, in where you end up landing. And I've always felt very comfortable in the counseling space. It's always been part of my professional identity. And even though I've gone down that road of getting additional education in psychology, it's never been the part that really fit for me as a professional identity. So I think that they are really each similar. So if you look at psychology, you look at counseling, you look at social work, at the master's level, social work and counseling in almost all states can practice independently. The big challenge is that in many cases, psychology cannot. While there's a movement towards psychology licensure at the master's level, that's not taken hold at a national place yet. So the majority of master's level psychologists have to practice under the supervision of someone rather than independently. Whereas
Definitely.
social work and counseling can practice independently.
Yes. And with that psychologist or that person with the master's in psychology, they have to practice indefinitely under the licensure of someone else because they can never seek an independent license, correct? In most states.
In most states,
Most
yes.
states.
And so there was a question I saw posted in the chat just to build on that. My opinion on the doctoral degrees in counseling psychology or the PsyD. And I want to talk about that I believe most of or all the students are in counseling and CACREP.
Yes.
So the most difficult thing to think about if anybody's considering a doctorate in psychology or a doctorate in counseling, in PsyD or counseling psychology, is that there is very little that would carry over from your master's degree into that pathway as a doctoral degree. And there's even for the states where you would have a pathway to licensure, I believe there's 5 of them, where you can have a counseling degree and become a licensed psychologist. Most of them require your doctorate in counselor ed, but additional coursework or very specific coursework that's bent towards psychology. So what that means is that it would probably not be a CACREP accredited doctoral program because the identity is really aligned with the counseling profession. So it would have to be a very specific doctoral program that was not accredited, that was aligned with psychology, that gave you training, but was not accredited by the American Psychological Association. And then it's usually on a case-by-case basis in those 5 states. So it's not even a very easy pathway, even for the ones that exist. So what I typically tell students is that there's not a huge difference in terms of practice ability. So instead of repeating a master's degree in your pathway to a doctorate in counseling psychology or clinical psychology, The best path and easiest path is a doctorate in counselor education, just because you've already got the master's degree. A doctorate is typically 90 credits as a entry pathway. Most doctorates end up with about 120, but the minimum is 90, including your master's degree. So what that means is that you'd have 60 from your CACREP accredited master's program, and then you'd probably take another 60 for a doctorate. If you went toward the PsyD or the counseling psychology PhD, you're probably taking another 120 credits. And that is basically repeating everything from scratch. Even if you've got a history course of counseling and you're going through theories, right? Those aren't typically psychology theories or looking at the history of psychology and leaders in psychology and authors in psychology. So you're relearning, and what they typically call it is a retread, somebody that's retraining and going through the process of unlearning your identity and relearning a new identity, which would be a very difficult process to go through. But in terms of counseling psychology and clinical psychology, they're really very different in terms of their perspectives on how they train. And counseling psychology is the most aligned with a counselor ed degree. Yeah, very similar. If you look at the coursework they take and the training, you're going to find very little different in terms of the approach. Now, what you also need to know is that in a psychology doctoral program, if it is accredited by the American Psychological Association compared to CACREP programs, your internship goes into a national matching system, just like medical residency.
Yep.
And so you do not know where you will match, and you do not know where you will be moving. And so you get matched and you move and you go and live there just like a medical resident would do for that process. So you'd have to upend your life and go wherever it is to do that APA accredited internship.
Well,
And
I was glad you mentioned that, because that's usually one of the big turnoffs for a lot of people is they don't understand the residential matching process, and
yeah,
that it is 1 full year of your life. And in some weird part of my other life, we had clinical psychologists and counseling psychology students at one of my sites, and there were degrees to which me and the other counselors could supervise them at some level, but we also had their professor, a doctoral professor in psychology that did a majority of that. And in a lot of cases, it is like you said, it's a very different professional identity. It's a very different level of thinking. And I mean, it takes some difference in thought. It's like if somebody comes to you and says, I'm interested in going into mental health, and they don't know if they're more on the sociological side or the psychological side. It's kind of a conversation with them to know where their mind is oriented, what they're interested in doing. Are they interested in more testing and diagnostics and things like that? Are they interested more in the education and or talk therapy approaches? In which we often, not always, use a little less assessment and a little more relationship. I think it would be fair to say.
mhm. And so Kathleen had a question in the chat about whether there's only one accreditation, and that is correct. And the reason being because each of those accrediting bodies, whether you're talking about COAMFs, whether you're talking about CACREP, whether you're talking about APA, have requirements for professional identity. And then they have very specific coursework that you have to take. And that coursework doesn't align between each of those programs. And so there are cases where, for example, in Pennsylvania, where I live, the marriage and family therapy licensure process is pretty flexible, and given a couple of courses that align in a counseling program, you could become licensed as a marriage and family therapist or an LPC. You could hold both, but your program's not going to be a marriage and family program, a marriage and family therapy program. It's still going to be a counseling accreditation program, but there's a pathway that allows some flexibility for licensure in that area. If you take some specific courses and make sure that you've got that alignment, but the program's going to be just accredited by one entity.
So I have one more question, and then we can take any other questions the students have as we're getting closer to the top of the hour. As you look ahead, what types of changes or trends do you think CACREP accreditation will have? Like what do you see coming in our future from CACREP, and how can students and faculty stay informed about what is coming down the pipeline?
You're good on the loaded questions. I think for me, the first thing that comes to mind are two things, and that's going to be more along the lines of technology, specifically to, well, not just, well, including supervision and technology, and getting a little better stance on online programs and their perspective of online versus hybrid versus on ground. That's just my gut. I would like to hear what Dr. Sheperis thinks, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, I think you're right on target that technology has to be one of the growth areas. It's mentioned once in the new CACREP standards.
Sure.
I do a lot of talks around artificial intelligence in healthcare. And this is one of the areas where we are far behind. And I'll give you an example, and this has nothing to do with the faculty here or with your program. This is every program I've looked at across the country. Because the accreditation body has not made the technology a heavy focus, there's very little that happens in terms of coursework around technology in any counseling program in the United States. There are a couple that have some technology focal points or minors, basically, that you can do that. But for the most part, it's missing. And what we're already seeing, for example, is clients using mental health chatbots. Like there's one called Tess, and there's already 27 million people using it. But we're not training our counselors on how to use those chatbots. And so the clients are learning more about it than the counselors are. And so we have a long way to go with that. And it's not just counseling, it's the medical profession, it's nursing. AI is changing the way all things are done, and we've got to change curriculum to fix that. And CACREP has to be proactive and start to think about how they're going to revise their standards quicker or have some change to their standards that really focuses on the technology evolution. Typically, CACREP revises their standards every they revise them every 10 years, but every 6 to 8 years is when they start the process and go through it. And so we had the 2014 standards and we have the 2024 standards. So it's not going to be for another 6 years before they start the process of revision again. So something has to happen before there because of how fast technology is evolving. And we really have to move that forward quickly. I think the other piece in terms of where I see us evolving, when CACREP first started, there were only a handful of counseling programs that became accredited. And it grew to like 50, and then it was 100. And now we're looking at, I think, over 400 programs or 500 programs that are CACREP accredited. And what that should tell you as students is how much effort universities are putting into producing more counselors throughout the world. And no matter how many we produce, there is a critical shortage area in almost every county in the United States and throughout the world, even more so. And so we just can't have enough accredited programs or produce enough practitioners to meet the demand. Once you get out there and get licensed, what we're seeing today in the world of practice is people with backlogs of a waiting list and just trying to get in to see someone. And it just is, we need more of you. We need you to finish the program, get out there, and get your license and keep practicing because the world needs you. And that's going to continue as a future process. We could look at it for the next 20 years. And in the career development space, it looks at what they call a bright outlook, that it's going to grow faster and have more job openings than most other professions on the planet.
I would add, especially if you're willing to do clinical mental health work in shortage areas, and which means moving. Because, you know, I live in a part of Texas that we're pretty saturated with counselors because we have multiple programs. But if those students move, if they go into rural areas, if they go into, areas with shortages, you're always going to have a job. And if you're willing to work in schools and hospital settings and different things, and especially integrated clinics, you're always going to find work.
Yes. Dr. Sheperis too, and Dr. Dickson, thank you for mentioning technology. One of the things that came up in one of the classes that I'm teaching is an article recently published that noted that some people believe that chatbots and AI they are as effective for some people as counselors. So it's really important for counselors to go in and see what their competition is and how they can integrate that into the work that they're doing. Doesn't have to be us or them. They can be integrated and work together. Hopefully CACREP catches up and allows that.
So some of the chatbots that are out there, Dr. RushWilson, have gone through clinical trials and actually
Yes.
show clinically significant reduction in depression, anxiety, those.
Mhm.
But that's not meant to be a replacement to the therapy
Right.
process. It's meant to be an adjunct to it. And so you learning how to use that in between sessions, and to use it to further somebody's growth at a more rapid pace, and get into a more stable domain by using these tools to our advantage.
Excellent. Yes. Okay, let's take these last 10 minutes and nice 9 minutes, I think, 9 minutes and answer what questions we have. Are there any questions from students? Feel free to come
We
up.
have several in the chat. Yeah.
Sure. All right, so let's look and see. Saw one that just popped
I can
up.
give Evangelina a very biased answer on what she had asked a second ago about getting licensed in Florida or Illinois. My absolute biased answer is Florida, because as a director of clinical training, I have less trouble with Florida, but that is completely personal. And to your question on Europe, I will tell you right now, Europe is a whole town hall by itself. It is a nightmare as far as getting licensed, or also if you were asking about if you were to be licensed in these states and living in Europe, that's going to be state to state specific. And there's going to be possible issues there, but European licensure is very, very different.
And have different courses sometimes that are
Oh,
required
yeah.
depending on which country in Europe you're talking about. Yep. Someone said an AI chatbot can't replace the interpersonal skills. That's true. We've been working on the chatbot thing since Eliza in the 1960s. You should go online and look up Eliza. You can see where we started with this. We've evolved quite significantly.
Or the concept of early telehealth, which around the same time I was a bachelor's student, their idea of telehealth was rolling a TV in the room when the doctor was in another room. And that was telehealth. That was seeing the doctor from a video screen, not what we're thinking of. And it was very, very different. So they may be down in their office at the psychiatric unit way down there. And instead of having to, be down there with the people, they would literally just roll a television into the room with a closed circuit television. That's, and Eliza, that's where technology started. And it's very different. And I was in my bachelor's degree in the early 90s, and they were still doing some of that. Matter of fact, I worked at the hospital in Nebraska, the state hospital in Nebraska that was the first hospital to do it. Very, very interesting.
So to comment on Evelina's questions, I agree with Dr. Dickson that Florida is your best choice. And the reason being is one of the more rigorous licenses. If you get licensed in Florida, it's easy to get licensed anywhere else, because it has some additional requirements above just the 60 credits that have a couple of additional workshops and things you have to do that just it's the most rigorous in terms of licensure process. So doing that, I think, is a good process. And then a lot of places in Europe don't have licensure yet. Some do. And in many cases, Europe is bachelor's level. And so there, like you were saying, Dr. Dickson, because there's so many countries in Europe, it's a process. You'd have to be real specific about which country you're talking about and where would you operate from. And then the states, each state is different about what they consider telehealth and where you have to live, of whether it's domestic in the US or not. And so in some cases you would be able to, like if you were licensed in Florida and you were living in Europe, you in some cases would be able to provide therapy via telehealth just to people in that state. It's impossible to think you would get licenses in all 50 states, so you'd have to think about which licenses you wanted to get. I think my wife has 5 that she maintains. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of CEUs to keep up with, a lot of paperwork, right? So it has to be worth your while. You really have to be thinking about how many clients am I going to get from a particular state, and how much effort do I want to put into that process.
So let me read this one. Thank you, Dr. Sheperis. This one question here. Will CACREP allow practicum internship hours for degree completion to be done entirely telehealth, telebehavioral health for those with circumstances such as those who will be residing temporarily overseas or on military orders? The current CACREP standards do not explicitly state that the hours have to be done in person, but my understanding is that the Chicago School is currently mandating all hours be done in person. That's more of a Dr. Dickson question.
Well, I would say so a lot of that will go back to the fact that we maintain the strictest rules of the strictest states, and there are some states that don't, let's say this, don't have a clear stance on telehealth. Some states that have a very firm stance on telehealth, and then some that are in the middle. And so for us, what we think of is, I personally, as a professor, do not think about licensing a person like in the one state that they live, but I want them to be able to have as much interstate accessibility. It's like I said earlier, if you're willing to move, you'll always find a job. And I just prefer, if you in my own personal practice, would be that you go with the most restrictive, even though it's a little less convenient in school, to open up your opportunities once you graduate. And then somebody asked me about Illinois, my bias. My bias is what Dr. Sheperis said. Florida has a little better course requirements. They tend to be a little easier just for us to manage as an institution, and for the student to work through the process. I saw Dr. Rice there. He lives there. He can tell you for sure. And then Illinois,
The crowd.
we've just run into, not just us at this school, but multiple places that I've dealt with, just kind of run into road bumps that make Illinois a little frustrating at like the bureaucratic level. So that's just my opinion. You may find somebody that lives in Illinois that finds them quite easy to work with.
Well, I thank you all for your time. Dr. Carl Sheperis, I'm so glad to see you. Dr. Cody Dickson, you too, even though I see you more often. Thank you both for your time. Thank all of you for your questions and your attention. If you'd like to contact Dr. Sheperis or Dr. Dickson, contact Dr. Dickson on your own. You know how to do that. If you want to get in touch with Dr. Sheperis, is there a way anyone can contact you, or would you like them to contact me and me forward the message? What works best?
Chat.
Whatever you want.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, Dr. Sheperis put his email address in the chat. You have Dr. Dickson's information and mine. Thank you all for your time, and have a good evening.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Did Dr. Sheperis leave? Are you still here?
I don't know.
Still here.
Oh, he's still here. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna, you said a minute ago, me and Tiffany were talking earlier. We couldn't remember where you were currently residing. Then you said Pennsylvania earlier. Where are you at now?